Hey everyone, tonight we're going back. We have got a Tuesday morning inside a 1950s American kitchen, where the grocery list has been living on the counter since Sunday, the car keys are hanging on the hook by the door, and the week is not going to feed itself. We have got the story of Clarence Saunders, the man from Memphis who invented the modern supermarket, changed the way an entire nation fed itself, nearly conquered Wall Street with a financial maneuver so audacious that the exchange changed its own rules to stop him, and then lost almost everything he had built in a sequence of events that still reads, a century later, like something a novelist would reject for being too implausible to be commercially viable. We have got a day behind the counter at a neighbourhood grocery in the early 1950s, where the job is equal parts memory, craftsmanship, diplomacy, physical endurance, and the kind of quiet social intelligence that nobody puts on a job application but that holds a neighbourhood together in ways no one ever formally acknowledges. And we have got the hidden architecture of the American supermarket, what the weekly circular and the fluorescent lighting and the carefully planned floor layout were specifically designed to make you not think about, what the store knew about your shopping habits that you did not know about your own shopping habits, and what all of it was quietly costing you in ways that were never itemised anywhere on your receipt. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up and let us go back together. You wake up on a Tuesday morning in 1953 and the first thing your awareness settles on is the refrigerator. Not a dramatic sound, nothing worth waking over, just the low, slightly irregular cycling of the motor, a sound the kitchen makes in the early morning when the house is quiet enough to actually hear it, when the children are still asleep, and the street outside has not yet committed to its daytime volume. You have been hearing that refrigerator since the week after your wedding, 4 years ago, and it has become as familiar to you as your own breathing, the kind of domestic presence you stopped consciously registering before the first winter was out. But this morning it finds you before you have even turned over, and you lie there for a moment in the particular half-consciousness of someone who knows what day it is before they are fully awake. It is Tuesday. Tuesday is grocery day. Your body already knows this with an animal certainty that precedes thought. You do not lie there long. The day has a schedule, and the schedule does not begin with you, it begins with the house, which requires certain things of the morning before you require anything of yourself. The children will be up within 30 minutes. Your husband leaves by 7:15. Breakfast is not something that happens at this hour so much as something that is produced, assembled from its components, in the correct order, at the correct time with the particular efficiency of someone who has made Tuesday breakfast so many times that the sequence has become a kind of muscle memory, hands moving without consulting the conscious mind about what comes next. You dress quickly and quietly, because the children sleeping is a resource that still has a few minutes in it, and you do not waste resources. The kitchen in the early morning of 1953 has a specific geography that is worth pausing to understand, because it is the geography of a working room that has been organised by daily use into something close to optimal. Everything is where it is for a reason that is rarely articulated but is immediately apparent to anyone who tries to cook in it. The canisters of flour and sugar and coffee are on the counter to the left of the stove, because those are the ingredients used most often and the stove is the centre of operations. The pots hang on hooks above the stove because hanging pots are accessible without crouching, and crouching 60 times a day adds up. The refrigerator is to the right, which means the triangle between refrigerator and counter and stove is walked continuously. The small shuffling geography of cooking, a path worn into the linoleum in a way you would see if you looked, though you never look because you are always moving along it. The linoleum itself is a subject. It is a pale yellow with a small geometric pattern, purchased when you moved in because the previous flooring had seen things you preferred not to inherit, and it is cleaned every morning with a damp mop and a specific kind of floor cleaner that comes in a green bottle and smells like something between pine and institutional authority. The cleanliness of the linoleum is not a vanity, it is a practical necessity, because children track things in and spill things, and the kitchen floor is a surface that the family spends its daily life near, and near is close enough that you need to know what is on it. You put on the coffee first, which is always first, because the coffee takes time and the time it takes is time during which you can accomplish other things. The percolator, a chrome sunbeam on the left side of the counter, is filled with water measured to the line and fitted with its basket of fresh Maxwell House ground coffee, which you buy in the red can and store in the pantry and transfer to the coffee tin on the counter as needed. You press the button and the percolator begins its work, which makes a sound that is one of the reliable pleasures of the morning. The initial pop and then the gradual acceleration into a continuous percolating rhythm that tells you the kitchen is alive and the day has officially begun. While the coffee works, you take the eggs from the refrigerator. You keep them on the second shelf, not the door shelf, because your mother told you that the door is the warmest part of a refrigerator and eggs do better at a steadier temperature, and your mother knew this from experience and had strong views about eggs, and you absorbed those views the way you absorbed most things from her, not through discussion, but through proximity. The eggs go into the pan with the butter, 2 eggs for your husband scrambled the way he likes them, which is not wet and not dry, but somewhere precisely in the middle that he has never needed to specify, because you have been making his eggs long enough to have calibrated the middle without requiring instruction. Your husband comes into the kitchen at 6:45 with the particular quality of morning presence that means he is awake and functional, but not yet fully assembled, wearing his work clothes but without his tie, his face recently shaved in a way you can tell by the faint clean smell of his shaving soap, which he uses every morning and which you bought him for Christmas 3 years running because he likes it, and because knowing what someone likes is one of the practical advantages of marriage. He sits at the kitchen table with his coffee and his newspaper, and you put the eggs in front of him, and this transaction is conducted in the companionable near silence of a weekday morning, which is its own kind of intimacy. The ordinary intimacy of 2 people sharing a routine so well established, it requires almost no words. The children appear in the sequence in which they always appear. The older one first, because the older one is a child who wakes promptly and presents herself to the morning with a certain alertness that you recognize as yours and find both gratifying and slightly exhausting. The younger one second, trailing the smell of sleep, requiring the gentle herding toward chair and bowl that small children require. Not resistant exactly, but not quite gravity-assisted either. Oatmeal for both, because it is the kind of morning in early March that calls for oatmeal, cold coming through the window glass in a way that suggests the furnace is doing its best but is not entirely winning, and oatmeal is the correct response to that kind of morning. You put brown sugar and a small pool of cream on each bowl, which is how they like it and how you liked it as a child and how your mother made it, and there is something in the continuity of that detail, the brown sugar and the cream on Tuesday oatmeal, that you do not examine but that is there, a small thread connecting your Tuesday to all the Tuesdays before it. Your husband leaves at 7:12, which is 3 minutes earlier than usual, which means the traffic on Elm Street was good yesterday, and he is adjusting his departure accordingly, a calculation you can follow even without asking because you know his routines with the completeness that comes from years of quiet observation. The door closes, the children eat, the kitchen settles into its second phase, the post-breakfast phase, the phase of dishes and clearing, and the particular organisation of thought that grocery day requires. The list is on the counter. It has been there since Sunday, begun in pencil on a piece of notepaper from the small pad kept in the kitchen drawer that also holds the scissors and the rubber bands and the pencil stub that is the dedicated kitchen pencil, replaced when it becomes too short to hold but not before, because pencil stubs have the remainder of their useful life in them, and discarding things with useful life remaining is something you were raised to find uncomfortable. The list has been added to on Monday morning when you opened the refrigerator and assessed, added to again Monday afternoon when you thought of the thing you had forgotten, and assessed a final time last night when you went through the pantry with the specific attention of someone taking inventory, which is exactly what you were doing. The list is organised by aisle. This is not something you decided to do. It evolved over the years of shopping at the A&P on Main Street, the route through the store so habitual that when you write the list, you automatically sort by location, produce first because the produce is nearest the entrance, then the dairy because the dairy is at the back and you plan the walk accordingly, then the canned goods and dry goods in the order the aisles run, meat last because Harold at the counter wraps things in white paper, and the paper packages go on top. The list is a map as much as it is a record. You put on your lipstick before you put on your coat. This is not vanity in the way vanity is sometimes dismissed, the frivolous cultivation of appearance for the purposes of drawing attention. This is something more specific and more social, the particular presentation of a woman who is going out into the neighbourhood, who will be seen by people she knows, who will talk to the cashier and the butcher, and the other women moving through the store with their own lists and their own carts and their own Tuesdays. Going out without lipstick would feel like appearing without something necessary. You could not tell someone who has never felt this exactly what it would mean, but the feeling of it is real, specific, and familiar to every woman you know. A small act of preparation that is also a small act of self-respect and of respect for the social world you're about to move through. The drive to the A&P takes 9 minutes on a light traffic morning, 7 if the light on Chestnut Street cooperates, 11 if it does not and you catch the freight train on Division. The car is a 1951 Ford in dark green, a colour that looked distinguished on the lot and looks competent on the street, and that you have come to feel genuine affection for in the way you feel genuine affection for anything reliable that has been through the seasons with you. You know how this car handles. You know the way the clutch catches just above the floor, the slight delay in the steering that you have compensated for so completely you no longer notice it. The sound the heater makes when it is cold outside, a faintly laboured cycling that means it is working hard but working. The parking lot at the A&P is its own social world in miniature. You recognise cars. You recognise the blue Dodge that belongs to Martha from the Tuesday Morning Bridge group, which means Martha is having the same Tuesday you are having, and you will either see each other in the store or you will miss each other by minutes, and it will not matter either way. You recognise the station wagon that belongs to the woman whose name you always confuse with someone else's name, which has been a source of mild private embarrassment for 2 years, and which you have addressed by simply not using her name when you speak to her. A solution so successful that she has no idea the problem exists. You take a cart from the line at the entrance, executing the specific slight manoeuvre that separates one cart from the next, which requires exactly as much technique as nothing outside a grocery store requires, and which you perform without thought. The cart wheels make their sound on the tile. The store receives you in its usual way, which is to say the fluorescent lights and the cool air and the particular combination of smells that is completely specific to this store and to no other place in the world, even though it also happens to be the smell of the A&P 3 towns over, and probably the A&P in 40 other states, because the A&P has a smell the way a brand has an identity, assembled from its ingredients so consistently that it becomes a signature. There is the cool, metallic note from the refrigerated cases, which you feel before you smell it, the temperature differential arriving ahead of the scent itself. There is the yeasty warmth from somewhere behind the bakery shelves, bread that baked this morning and whose smell has dispersed through the store in the way a pleasant smell will, expanding to fill the available space while maintaining enough concentration to be noticed. There is the green, slightly wet smell of the produce section, celery and lettuce and the particular sharpness of citrus, the oranges in their mesh bags and the grapefruit stacked in their wooden crate with the name of the Florida Grove stenciled on the side in orange letters, and underneath all of it, the clean, slightly chemical smell of institutional cleanliness, the floor mopped at 6 this morning with something designed to smell of nothing while smelling of order. The produce section is where you begin, not because it is the most important part of the trip, but because it is the section nearest the entrance, and this is where the list begins. You have been doing this long enough that the two things are the same. The list begins here because this is where you begin, and you begin here because the list begins here, a circular logic that is also a practical truth. Iceberg lettuce, 1 head. You assess it with the pressure of 2 fingers against the outer leaves, feeling for the solid, dense resistance of a tight head versus the loose, slightly disappointing softness of one that has been sitting since Saturday. This is knowledge in your hands as much as your head. You have pressed 10,000 heads of lettuce in your life and the information comes back to you through your fingertips without requiring translation. Celery, 1 bunch. You want the stalks gathered tightly at the base, pale green shading to cream at the bottom, the leaves at the top still bright enough to suggest they have opinions about being there. The celery that has been sitting since last Thursday has a slightly hollow quality, the stalks less taut, the leaves beginning to show the first suggestions of yellow at the edges. You find a fresh bunch and put it in the cart. Tomatoes 3, which in early March means tomatoes from somewhere considerably warmer than here, shipped in while still firm and sold in a state that is technically ripe and practically only adjacent to the flavour of the August tomatoes your mother-in-law brings over in a paper bag in the summer, the ones she grew in her backyard from plants she started from seed on her windowsill in February. Those tomatoes, the August ones, are the actual tomatoes. These are the functional tomatoes, the tomatoes that will slice and serve their purpose and provide the nutritional content they are supposed to provide, and you buy them without complaint because complaint about March tomatoes would be complaint about March, which you have never found particularly productive. Bananas, one hand. Green enough that the skin still shows yellow-green at the stem end, because bananas bought on Tuesday at the right degree of unripe will be properly yellow and ready on Thursday, which is when your children will eat the first two and leave the rest, which will carry through the weekend if the kitchen is not too warm. You have had this calculation go wrong. You bought 2 ripe bananas once when you were in a hurry, and by Wednesday they were the kind of bananas that served no purpose except banana bread, which you made and which was good but was not the plan. And departing from the plan has a specific quality of mild domestic frustration that you prefer to avoid through better banana selection. Oranges, the mesh bag of 6 for your husband's morning juice. He has been drinking orange juice every morning since before you knew him, and he will drink it every morning for the rest of his life, you are reasonably certain, with the quiet consistency of a man who has found his morning routine and intends to honour it. The juice comes from a can of frozen concentrate in the freezer, pressed and stirred into cold water every morning in the kitchen while the coffee percolates, a double ritual of morning liquids that has become as basic a domestic structure as the children's bedtimes or Sunday dinner. You move through the store in the order the list dictates, which is the order of the store itself, which you have internalized so completely that the list and the store are essentially the same document read at different times. Canned tomatoes, 2 cans, Del Monte, because the Del Monte makes a better pot roast than the store brand, a judgment you arrived at through actual experience and not through advertising, though the advertising helped you form the initial preference in a way that you're not entirely unaware of and that you find mildly interesting to notice. Canned corn, 3 cans, the Green Giant, because the Green Giant corn is sweeter than the others, and your younger child will eat it without negotiation, which is the most powerful recommendation any food in this house can receive. Campbell's tomato soup, 4 cans, not for soup this week but for the pork chops you're planning on Thursday. Braised in tomato soup in a way that your husband's mother taught you, and that produces a result so satisfying it seems like more than the sum of its parts. The cereal aisle requires its own navigation. There are the cereals your children want, informed by what Saturday morning television has been telling them, which this week means a box with a cartoon figure on the front, making claims about energy and strength that the box makes no attempt to substantiate with specifics. There are the cereals you're prepared to purchase. The overlap between these two categories is real, but limited. You take the Cheerios, which is acceptable to everyone without inspiring strong feeling in anyone. A cereal that occupies the middle ground between what children want and what parents prefer with the diplomatic skill of a product that has been tested by a lot of Tuesday morning negotiations. You take the cream of wheat for weekday mornings when there is time to stand at the stove, and a box of Kellogg's cornflakes because cornflakes is the cereal equivalent of a reliable blue coat. Nothing exciting about it and exactly right for situations where excitement is not what you need. Flour, a 5-pound bag, because Sunday is a baking day and the canister on the counter is running low, and running out of flour on a Sunday morning when you intend to make biscuits is the kind of domestic failure that could be prevented with attention to the canister level, and you have been attending to the canister level, which is why flour is on the list. Sugar, the same 5-pound bag. Baking powder, the small can of Calumet, with the double-acting formula on the label that your mother used and that you have used without questioning because questioning it would require a reason, and the biscuits have given you none. Vanilla, a small brown bottle of pure extract, not imitation, because the imitation has a slightly chemical aftertaste that you can detect and that bothers you in a way that is disproportionate to its significance, and that you have therefore simply decided to avoid by buying the real thing. Coffee, the large Maxwell House can, the 1-pound size that will last the household its allotted period before needing replacement. The Maxwell House red can is so familiar to you that you locate it without looking for it, your hand going to the right shelf at the right position before your eyes have confirmed the location. This is the category of product relationship that does not get discussed, but that every woman who runs a kitchen has with a dozen different items. The brand loyalty that is made not of advertising but of thousands of repeated positive experiences that have accumulated over years into something indistinguishable from preference. You add crackers, the Ritz, which your husband likes with cheese in the evening, a small domestic pleasure he took up sometime in the last year, and that you have made a quiet point of accommodating, because the accommodating costs you nothing, and the pleasure it gives him is genuine. You add peanut butter, the Jif, because the children eat it on sandwiches most school days, and the jar is more than half empty. You add a loaf of bread, Wonder Bread in its red, yellow and blue dots, which is the bread your household uses for sandwiches and toast, soft and consistent and reliable in a way that the artisan bakeries of a later era will not have the vocabulary to appreciate. You add grape jelly, because peanut butter and grape jelly is a relationship that has been established in this household at the level of constitutional amendment and requires no deliberation. The dairy case is at the back of the store as you expected it to be, as it always is, and you arrive there having passed everything else, which is exactly what the store intended when it placed the dairy at the back. You know this. You have known this for years. The dairy case is at the back because milk and butter are on almost every family's list, and placing them at the back means every family walks past everything else on the way there and back, and every walk past everything else is an opportunity for the store. Knowing this does not change the fact that the dairy case is where you need to go. Knowledge of the mechanism does not dissolve the mechanism. The dairy case has its specific cold, more serious than the ambient cool of the refrigerated cases elsewhere in the store, a cold that reaches you as you approach, a wall of chilled air that your hands feel first, the way temperature changes register on the skin before they register in the mind. You take the butter, 1 pound, salted, the same brand you have always bought, in the same yellow wrapper with the same printing. You take the milk, 2 quarts, the glass bottles cold and wet with condensation in your hand, the kind of cold that communicates through the skin to the palm and then up the arm in a sensation that is refreshing in summer and simply cold in March. You open the egg carton before putting it in the cart and check each egg with a quick, efficient press, feeling for the solidity of an uncracked shell, moving through the dozen in less than 15 seconds. One has a small hairline crack in the side that you can feel under your thumb. You replace the carton and take the next one. You add the sour cream for Thursday's casserole, a dish your neighbour gave you the recipe for last fall, written on a 3x5 card in her handwriting, which you keep in the recipe box on the counter between the flour canister and the coffee tin. The recipe calls for a cup of sour cream added near the end, and you have made it 4 times now, and it has been good each time, which is the standard by which recipes earn their permanent place in the rotation. Harold is at the meat counter when you arrive, as he is most Tuesday mornings. Harold is a large man with hands that look like they were designed for this particular work. Broad and sure-looking, a man who has been a butcher for 20 years and who wears his white apron with the particular ease of someone for whom the uniform has long since stopped feeling like a uniform. You have bought your meat from Harold for 3 years, and in that time you have reached the comfortable working arrangement of 2 people who understand each other's requirements without needing to rehearse them every week. You ask for 1.5 pounds of ground beef. Not the lean, because the lean makes the meatloaf dry, and your husband prefers meatloaf that has some moisture and some texture, a preference he expressed once, mildly, without emphasis, and which you received and filed and have honoured without further discussion ever since, because that is how domestic preferences communicate and perpetuate themselves, through a single expression, and then silence, and then practice. Harold goes to the case and takes the roll of ground beef that is right for what you're asking for, not the extra lean and not the fatty end, but the 80% lean that is the correct ground beef for a meatloaf or for hamburgers, or for the kind of pasta sauce that needs substance in it. He puts it on the scale and the needle swings to 1 pound and 6 ounces, and he trims a small piece off and puts it back, and the needle settles at 1.5 pounds, and you say thank you, and he wraps it in white paper with the practiced fold that tucks the corners under and presses the seam flat, and he writes the price with his grease pencil, the numbers appearing in thick, slightly greasy strokes. You ask for pork chops, 3 of them, thick cut because thin pork chops require a timing precision that you're not always going to have on a Thursday afternoon when the children are home and the kitchen is at its least cooperative. Thick chops forgive a minute or 2 of inattention. You ask for a chuck roast, 2.5 to 3 pounds. Harold turns to the case with the ease of a man who knows where things are, and he finds a roast and holds it up, and you look at it and nod because the size looks right and you have no reason to doubt it, and he wraps it with the same efficient folding and marks it the same way. You talk while he wraps. It takes perhaps 3 minutes. The weather, which is cold, his wife's sister, who recently had a baby, the fact that his youngest started school in September and has opinions about kindergarten that Harold relays with the affection of a man who is quietly impressed by his child. This is not small talk in the sense of meaningless talk. It is the kind of brief human transaction that keeps two people in each other's lives at a decent, warm, neighbourly distance, the particular frequency of contact that characterises functional community, not intimate but not blank, not obligated but not impersonal either. The checkout line has two people ahead of you, which is a comfortable wait, enough time to do the quick mental arithmetic of your cart against your budget without being either hurried or stranded. The cashier is Betty, whose last name you do not know and have never asked, who is perhaps 23 and who punches the register keys with an efficiency that you have observed many times and that remains quietly impressive. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The metallic thunk of each key and the numbers advancing in the register window, a small rapid theatre of commerce. Betty does not chat while she works. She is pleasant and correct and fast, which you appreciate because you have places to be, and the checkout line is not one of them. The total is $12.37. You take the bills from your wallet and count out exact change because you always carry enough change for the grocery trip, a habit learned from your mother who had her own grocery discipline and communicated it the way she communicated most things, through demonstration rather than instruction. The coins are in the tray. Betty sweeps them into her register without counting them, which is her assessment of your reliability, a small professional compliment that you receive in the same spirit it is given. Gary, the teenager who bags and carries, loads your 2 brown paper bags with the usual arrangement, canned goods at the bottom, bread and eggs and tomatoes on top, meat packages on the very top of the top. He carries one bag, and you carry the other, and he loads them into the back seat of the Ford, and you hand him his dime. The dime is not optional. Tipping Gary is part of the grocery transaction, the same way saying thank you is part of the grocery transaction, a social obligation that does not feel like an obligation because you would do it anyway. The drive home, the groceries go away in the order that has been established through years of Tuesday grocery putting away. Milk first, because the milk is cold and should stay cold. Eggs into the carton space in the refrigerator, second shelf. Butter and sour cream. Meat packages on the lowest refrigerator shelf where it is coldest, because your mother told you that meat should always go on the lowest shelf, and this is the kind of advice that transfers directly and immediately into practice when it comes from someone whose kitchen operated without failure for 30 years. Produce to the crisper, celery at the back because it is tallest, lettuce wrapped in a damp cloth first, tomatoes loose, dry goods to the pantry, cans to their shelves, flour and sugar into the canisters. You stand for a moment in the kitchen with the folded paper bags over your arm. The refrigerator runs. The house is quiet. It is 10:42 in the morning, and the grocery trip is complete. The week is supplied, the pantry is replenished, and the Tuesday can proceed to its next phase. There is nothing ceremonial about this moment. It simply is what it is, which is the completion of a thing that needed doing, done well and done right, by someone who has been doing it long enough to do it without thinking about doing it. The thinking happened earlier, on Sunday and Monday, when the list was being built and the week was being planned. By Tuesday morning, the plan was already in motion, and Tuesday is the motion. You put the paper bags in the drawer under the sink where they live between grocery trips. They will be used for something, for lining the kitchen trash or for carrying something, or for any one of the dozen nameless small uses that a household generates for paper bags, uses that do not have names because they happen below the threshold of named activity, in the functional, inventive, waste-avoiding middle ground of domestic management. Nothing is wasted here. Nothing is thrown away before its further uses are exhausted. This is not ideology. This is practice, learned in a decade that preceded this one and that left its habits in the people who lived through it. A decade of making things last and using things up and throwing nothing out that could serve another purpose. The week will be fed. The biscuits will come on Sunday. The meatloaf will come on Wednesday. The pork chops will come on Thursday, braised in Campbell's tomato soup in the way your husband's mother taught you, and the smell of it will move through the house from 4 o'clock onward, and the children will come into the kitchen to find out what that smell is, even though they have smelled it before and know exactly what it is. The pot roast will wait until Saturday, low in the oven all morning, filling the house with the smell of browned meat and vegetables and the particular warmth of a thing that requires time and patience. A smell that the people in this house will carry inside themselves for decades without necessarily knowing what they are carrying or where it came from. It came from here, from the Tuesday trip to the A&P and the list on the counter, and the $12.37 and Harold and the white paper packages and Betty at the register. It came from the competence and the planning and the quiet, continuous labour of someone who fed a family every week without drawing attention to the fact, which is the particular quality of invisible work that domestic life of this era required and rewarded with silence. To understand what Clarence Saunders was doing in 1916 when he opened the first Piggly Wiggly on Jefferson Avenue in Memphis, you have to spend a moment in the grocery store that existed before Piggly Wiggly, the grocery store as it had functioned for generations, a form so established that it felt less like a system someone had designed and more like a natural feature of the commercial landscape, a thing that simply was what it was because it had always been that way. The grocery store before Piggly Wiggly was a counter store. You came in, you waited, a clerk came to the counter, you told the clerk what you wanted, the clerk went and found it. If there were multiple things on your list, the clerk went and found multiple things, one by one or in organised trips through the back of the store. You did not touch the merchandise. The merchandise was arranged in ways that made sense to the store's organisation, not to your browsing convenience, because browsing was not a concept that applied here. You told, they fetched, you paid. This was how groceries were purchased in America for the entire history of American groceries up to that point, a transactional model so entrenched that its alternatives did not exist as alternatives. They did not exist as ideas. They were simply not part of the imaginative vocabulary available to anyone thinking about how grocery retail worked. Clarence Saunders was thinking about how grocery retail worked in the early 1910s, and he was thinking about it with the particular aggravation of someone who has spent years inside a system and cannot stop seeing its inefficiencies. He had been working in the grocery trade since he was a teenager, starting as a delivery boy in Clarksville, Tennessee, and working his way into increasingly responsible positions through the kind of industry and attention that was available to a young man of limited formal education who compensated for the limitation with abundant energy and an unusual capacity for seeing the structure of things that other people simply inhabited. By his early 30s, he was a wholesale grocer in Memphis, which meant he had a detailed operational understanding of what it took to move food from producers through distributors into stores and from stores into households, and he had a detailed operational understanding of where the system was losing money and time and efficiency at every point along the route. The inefficiency that concerned him most was at the retail end. The counter model required a clerk for every customer, or close to it. During busy periods, the line of waiting customers was a line of paying customers not yet spending, which meant the store's capacity to process purchases was throttled by the number of clerks available, which was throttled by what the store could afford to pay, which was throttled by the margin the store could make on the groceries it sold. The model was self-limiting in a way that someone with Saunders' eye for structure could see clearly, and it was self-limiting in a way that benefited from being solved. His solution arrived with the cleanness of an idea that is so correct it seems obvious in retrospect and seems impossible in the moment before it exists. The customers, he reasoned, do not need the clerk to fetch things. The customers can fetch things themselves if you arrange the store so that the things are accessible, individually labelled with their prices, organised by category, and placed in a defined path that leads the customer past the entire inventory before depositing them at a checkout point. The clerk becomes a cashier, a single efficient transaction at the end of a self-guided tour that the customer conducts on their own time at their own pace. No waiting, no bottleneck, no limit on how many customers can be in the store simultaneously, because each customer is their own self-service unit, moving through the designed space independently. He opened the first Piggly Wiggly on September the 6th, 1916, at 79 Jefferson Avenue in Memphis. The store was small by later standards, but it contained what Saunders had designed it to contain: shelves of individually priced products accessible to the customer without intermediary, a defined entry and exit path that moved customers through the entire store in sequence, and a checkout at the end where a single cashier could process a steady stream of customers who had already selected their purchases and were ready to pay. The price of each item was on the item, which was itself a novelty, a departure from a world where prices were negotiated at the counter or posted on a board and read aloud by someone who knew what things cost because they were paid to know what things cost. People came to look because the name was absurd enough to attract attention and the concept was unusual enough to hold it. and people who came to look found something that worked, something that was faster and less fraught than what they were used to, something that gave them control of their own shopping experience in a way the counter model never had. A woman who shopped at a counter store had to ask for everything, which meant she could only ask for things she already knew she wanted, which meant she could not discover, standing in an aisle, that she should probably also get the baking powder because she was low, or that the brand of canned peas she preferred was on sale this week, or that there was a new kind of crackers on the shelf that she had been curious about since seeing it advertised. The self-service model made browsing possible, and browsing turned out to be something people liked, because browsing is a form of small, low-stakes discovery, and people, it turns out, enjoy small low-stakes discovery in the context of buying groceries to a degree that nobody had previously measured because the opportunity had not previously existed. Saunders patented the concept with a thoroughness that reflected his understanding of what he had built. He patented the store layout, the self-service mechanism, the checkout system, and the overall design of what he called the self-serving store, a term that he applied without apparent awareness of its double meaning, though the double meaning is so apt that it seems like it should have been intentional. He franchised the Piggly Wiggly name and concept aggressively, moving through the South and then the Midwest and then across the country, with the speed and territorial ambition of a man who understood that first-mover advantage in a disrupted market is real and finite and needs to be converted into geography before the geography's gone. By 1920, there were over 600 Piggly Wiggly stores. By 1922, there were 1,200. Saunders was wealthy. He was wealthy in the way that people who have built something real and been the first to build it become wealthy, which is quickly and surprisingly, and with a completeness that sometimes outpaces the wisdom available to manage it. He was building a house outside Memphis that the newspapers were calling the Pink Palace, a mansion of pink Georgia marble on a 100-acre estate, with rooms that expanded in the planning as the construction proceeded, the house growing with the wealth that was generating it, a monument to a fortune that felt, from inside 1922, inexhaustible. He had borrowed against his Piggly Wiggly stock to finance the construction, which was common practice for a man of his situation, a man whose stock was trading well and rising, and who had every reason to expect the rise to continue. The stock was publicly traded on the New York Exchange, and it was doing what publicly traded stock in a growing company does, which is attract the attention of people whose business is trading stock rather than running companies. What happened next is one of the more remarkable episodes in American financial history, not because it ended Saunders' control of his company, which is a common enough story in the history of American enterprise, but because of the audacity with which Saunders responded to the threat, and the audacity with which the exchange responded to Saunders, and the way the whole episode ended in a manner that still raises questions about who the rules were designed to protect. A group of New York traders had begun shorting Piggly Wiggly stock. Shorting, in the technical language of the market, meant they were borrowing shares, selling them, and betting that the price would fall, at which point they would buy the shares back at the lower price, return them to whoever had lent them, and keep the difference as profit. Short selling was legal. It is still legal. It was common practice among traders who made their living on the volatility of stock prices, and it required nothing more than a judgment that a stock was overvalued and would correct. Saunders found out about the short selling, and was furious in the specific, energizing way of a man who has built something real and is watching it used as a gambling chip by people who have never operated a grocery store in their lives and never intend to. His fury converted itself rapidly into a plan, which was to corner the market in Piggly Wiggly stock, buying every available share until the short sellers could not find shares to buy back at any price, and were therefore trapped, forced to settle on his terms, which would be terms that reflected his assessment of what they deserved for betting against something he had built with his own intelligence and labour. Cornering a market was legal in 1922, barely, in the way that things are legal before they are common enough to generate the regulatory response that makes them illegal. Saunders moved. He began buying Piggly Wiggly shares through brokers acting on his behalf, accumulating a position that drove the share price steadily upward, while quietly contracting the float, the number of shares available for trading, to a level that created genuine distress among the short sellers, who found themselves looking at a position that was moving against them in a market that was becoming rapidly less liquid. He came close. He came very close. At the peak of what the financial press was calling the Piggly Wiggly corner, the stock had been driven to prices that bore no relationship to the underlying business, and the short sellers were in genuine difficulty, facing losses that were real and growing, and that would have become ruinous if Saunders had been allowed to complete what he had started. The New York Stock Exchange suspended trading in Piggly Wiggly stock. The exchange gave the short sellers extra time to locate shares and cover their positions. The stated rationale was that the conditions in the stock had become disorderly, and the exchange had authority to manage disorderly conditions, which was true. The practical effect was that the goalposts moved while Saunders was running for the end zone, moved in a direction that protected the short sellers at his expense, and the timing of the move left a question that Saunders spent the rest of his life asking, with the particular bitterness of a man who knows the answer but cannot prove it. When trading resumed, the price collapsed. The short sellers covered their positions at the lower price. Saunders was left with an enormous debt accumulated in the pursuit of the corner, and a stock position whose value had been dramatically reduced by the change in circumstances that the exchange had produced. He owed more than he had. He could not pay. He lost control of Piggly Wiggly, the company he had founded and named and built from an idea that had not existed 6 years before. He lost the Pink Palace, which stood nearly complete on its 100 acres, which he had never lived in, which was sold to pay his creditors and was eventually purchased by the city of Memphis. The Pink Palace is a museum today, a natural history museum on a wooded site in the eastern part of the city. Visitors walk through its galleries past exhibits on the natural world without necessarily knowing whose vision built the building they're walking through, or what that vision cost. Saunders was not finished. This is the thing about him that deserves more attention than the dramatic rise and fall that tends to occupy the story. He was not finished. He was angry and he was broke relative to where he had been, and he was stripped of the company he had created. But he was not without his idea, and his idea was the same idea it had always been, and the proof that it worked was still there in 1,200 stores across the country, under a name he was no longer allowed to use. He launched a new grocery chain in the mid-1920s, which he called with magnificent defiance the Clarence Saunders, sole owner of My Name stores. The name was long and awkward, and communicated with complete clarity how he felt about having lost his previous name to his creditors, and it was sometimes shortened in practice to the sole owner stores, but the long name was the real name, a declaration of what he still possessed even after everything else was gone. The stores were doing well, were expanding, were demonstrating once again that the self-service model worked, and that Saunders understood how to execute it, when the Depression arrived and the financing structures that had allowed the expansion collapsed along with everything else in the American economy of 1929 and after. The sole owner stores were lost. He spent the years after that working on the Key Doozle, an automated grocery store concept in which products were displayed behind glass, and customers moved through the store selecting items by inserting a key into a slot next to the item they wanted, and the mechanical system conveyed the selected items to a checkout point where they were waiting when the customer arrived. He built prototypes. He demonstrated them to investors and industry people. He believed in them completely, with the specific conviction of someone who has been right before and intends to be right again. The Key Doozle never achieved the reliability necessary for commercial deployment. The mechanical complexity was real, and the technology of the 1940s was not quite up to it. Though the concept was not wrong, only premature, and the direction it was pointing toward automated selection and automated checkout, was the direction retail was going to travel whether Saunders got there or not. He died in October 1953, which is the same year as our Tuesday morning, the same autumn our housewife is putting her groceries away and noting that the flour canister is replenished. He died in Memphis with fewer resources than the fortune he had accumulated and lost twice. A man who had given the American grocery store its essential modern form, and who had watched that form become universal during his own lifetime, had watched it become so thoroughly established that the people who used it daily had entirely forgotten that someone had needed to think of it. The open shelves and the individually priced items and the basket-carrying progress through organised aisles and the single cashier checkout. These things had a birthday and a father, and the father died before the birthday was widely celebrated. Piggly Wiggly still exists. There are several hundred Piggly Wiggly stores in the American South and Midwest, independently owned under the franchise that Saunders created, still operating under the name he chose for reasons he claimed not to remember precisely, but that worked exactly as he intended, by being strange enough to make people stop and look and find out what it was. The Pink Palace stands in Memphis with its natural history exhibits and its geological specimens and its planetarium in a wing added decades after the original building. And the way Americans buy their groceries, the way they take a cart and walk through organised aisles and put items in the cart and carry them to a cashier at the end, is the way Clarence Saunders designed it, without modification, in 1916, in a city on the Mississippi, in a building that drew a crowd partly because the name was ridiculous, and partly because the idea inside the ridiculous name was one of the most practically transformative ideas in the history of American commerce. You have been behind this counter for 6 years, which is long enough to have developed a relationship with your work that is something between expertise and intimacy. You work at the deli counter at Kowalski's Grocery and Market on Elm Street, which has been in the same location since 1931, and which in 1955 is running on a model that has not changed substantially since it opened, a model built around knowing what the neighbourhood needs and providing it reliably, and with the specific interpersonal warmth that makes a neighbourhood store different from a chain store, in a way that the neighbourhood can feel, even if it cannot always articulate it. The counter is your domain in the functional sense that any professional's workspace is their domain, organised around their needs and their knowledge and their particular way of doing the work. The deli case runs 12 feet along the left side of the store, a long glass case with a white enamel interior and fluorescent lighting inside the glass that makes the cold cuts and cheeses look their best, which is the point. The case holds what it always holds, the inventory that has been established by years of customer preference into a permanent fixture. Bologna, boiled ham, baked ham, salami, olive loaf, head cheese, liverwurst, turkey roll, and the special orders. The things that Mr. Kowalski stocks in smaller quantities for the customers who request them specifically, and who would be quietly disappointed to find them unavailable. The Münster, the hard salami, which is different from the regular salami, and which 3 or 4 customers consider non-negotiable on their weekly list. Your morning begins at 6:30, an hour before the store opens, because the counter requires preparation that cannot be hurried. You arrive in your coat and tie on your white apron, which is laundered at home on Monday night, and return to the hook by the stockroom door on Tuesday morning as fresh as a uniform can be, while still being a uniform that has seen regular service. You check the case with the systematic thoroughness of someone who knows that the presentation of the case is not a vanity, but a statement of professional standards, a direct communication to every customer who approaches it about the quality of what is inside. The trays need to be assessed. Anything that dried at the edges during the overnight needs to be trimmed. The clean cut that removes the dried surface and reveals the fresh beneath, done with the slicing knife at an angle that wastes as little as possible. The arrangement of the overlapping fans needs to be refreshed so that they look like this morning's display and not last evening's, which is a distinction in appearance that customers can sense even if they could not explain it. A slight tiredness in an arrangement that has been sitting versus the slight vitality of one that has been recently tended. You take pride in this. It is not the kind of pride that requires an audience. It is the kind of pride that requires only the standards you have set for yourself, which are the standards that Mr. Kowalski expects, and which you have made your own because your own standards are, if anything, slightly higher. The cheese needs to be assessed for the same reasons. The cheddar blocks at the right of the case, the sharp and the mild arranged with the sharp at front because most customers want. The sharp and the mild is for those who specify otherwise. The American, which is the most requested cheese at this counter by a margin that would surprise no one who works behind a deli counter in 1955, because the American is the cheese that everyone uses for every purpose, and none of the other cheeses are American in the way that American is American. The Swiss, sliced to order, which requires a slightly different technique on the slicer, because Swiss wants a slightly thinner cut than the other cheeses, a detail that you adjusted to early in your time here, and that is now entirely automatic. The Provolone, the Münster in its smaller portion of case, the brick cheese that 2 customers buy regularly and that nobody else seems to know about. The slicer is your primary instrument, a commercial Hobart that Mr. Kowalski bought used when he opened the deli counter 12 years ago, and that has been serviced reliably, and that runs with a consistent, slightly noisy efficiency of well-maintained equipment that is still doing exactly what it was built to do. The blade adjustment is a matter of feel after 6 years. You know where each calibration falls by the resistance of the dial and the look of the first test slice, which you always take before beginning a customer's order, adjusting if necessary with the quick, decisive movement of someone who has learned that indecision at the slicer wastes time and meat both. The morning customers arrive in their patterns. Mrs. Pellegrino at 7:45, which has been her arrival time for as long as you have been behind this counter, and, you suspect, for years before that. She is a precise woman with strong, established preferences about deli meat that have been communicated to you through a sequence of corrections and confirmations over the first year of your work here, until you now know them as well as you know anything you have been told, repeatedly enough to internalize completely. The salami at a thickness that she established through a dialogue of adjustments, a thickness that sits between paper thin and the thickness you would choose by default, specific enough that you dial the slicer to it before she arrives, because she arrives at 7:45 and you have had since 6:30 to prepare. The ham a little thicker than the salami, the provolone sliced last, freshest, laid on top. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You fill her order in her sequence, which means salami first, then ham, then cheese, each wrapped in the deli paper before the next is begun, because that is how she wants it, and you do not question preferences that are specific, held consistently, and cause no practical difficulty in the execution. You hold up the first slice for her confirmation, which she gives with the slight, contained nod of a woman who is receiving what she expected and is satisfied by the expectation being met, which is its own kind of trust, the trust that builds between a person and a service provider who has learned to get it right. There is a social dimension to the counter that is as real as its commercial dimension, a social dimension that is not part of the job description and that you have nonetheless understood as part of the job since your second month here. You are a point of information, not through gossip, not through any unseemly exchange of private matters, but through the natural accumulation of what people tell you and what you observe, and what 200 regular customers, coming in over the course of each week, communicate collectively about the state of the neighbourhood, its comings and goings, its sorrows and celebrations, its ordinary progress. You know Mr. Harrington takes only turkey, no red meat, and that his wife comes in separately and buys the olive loaf, and that these two facts are the map of a small domestic arrangement that you have drawn in your memory without intending to. You know that the young woman who comes in on Fridays is managing her budget tightly, which you can see in the way she hesitates before asking for one more slice, and in what she asks for, the bologna more often than the ham, the smaller quantities, the way she counts what she has before she asks for the last item on her list. You have adjusted the portion sizes for her orders in a way that is barely measurable and that you have never acknowledged or called attention to. You give her a generous slice and you do not comment on the generosity, and she receives it, and you both continue as if the transaction is perfectly ordinary, which it is, which is exactly what you want it to be. Mrs. Marchetti comes in for quantities that reflect the scale of what she's cooking, which is cooking for a table that feeds 8 people who are all genuinely hungry. Her orders are different in character from the orders of a household of 4. She wants 1.5 pounds of bologna rather than a half pound. She wants 2 pounds of American cheese. She wants the ham in a quantity that reflects the reality of 8 people having sandwiches over the course of a week, not 1 or 2 people doing the same. Filling her order requires that you think about her household in a way that differs from how you think about Mrs. Pellegrino's household, which requires thinking about the household at all, which is itself a specific kind of professional attention that nobody trained you in but that the work developed in you through necessity. You ask her how everyone is doing when she comes in, and she tells you because she has a lot to tell, and the counter is a place where she can tell it. Standing at a comfortable distance, talking to someone whose attention is genuine and professional at once, who will listen without the particular dynamic of obligation that comes with telling things to family or close friends. The counter is a safe middle distance for certain kinds of conversation. Not intimate enough to require reciprocation, not formal enough to require editing. She tells you that her oldest daughter got a promotion at the insurance office where she works, and that the son-in-law is better, he had been unwell through the winter, and that the youngest, the one still in school, is doing well in mathematics. This takes 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes you have sliced 2 pounds of American and 1.5 pounds of bologna, and you have been fully present to both the work and the conversation. There are also the harder elements of the work, the things that require the energy you have but that spend it in different ways than the pleasant transactions do. Mr. Kowalski in a difficult mood, which communicates itself from the back room in the form of a specific quality of silence that you have learned to read at 20 feet. A charged silence that means the morning's delivery was wrong, or the accounts are not adding up, or something at home came through the door with him, you navigate around the mood with the professional competence of someone who works closely enough to another person to know their states without being told, giving the back room its space while maintaining the front of the store at its regular level of function. The customers who are rude. They are not many, not most, but they are real. The person who speaks to you in the way that carries within it the assumption that the person behind the counter is not quite a full participant in the exchange, who addresses you with the specific impatience of someone who considers their time more valuable than yours by a self-assessed margin that they have never been asked to justify. You have a standard response to this, which is absolute pleasantness delivered at a steady and measured pace. You do not hurry, you do not become cold, you become very precisely professional, which says nothing that can be objected to and communicates everything that needs to be understood. You slice the order at the pace the order requires to be sliced correctly. You wrap it with the care the product deserves. You state the price. You hand it across the counter. You say, "Have a good day." The physical component of the work is its own honest demand. You have been on your feet since 6:30. By 2 in the afternoon, your feet have an opinion about linoleum that they would be happy to share with anyone who asked. An opinion that is specific, persistent, and not positive. Your lower back joins this conversation around noon. Your hands, which have been slicing and wrapping and lifting and reaching all morning, have a particular kind of tiredness in them by closing time that is the tiredness of hands that have been used precisely and continuously, a specific occupational fatigue that you carry home and that releases slowly through the evening, the kind of tired that is honest and earned, and that you find most nights does not follow you into sleep but lets you go at the door. You close the counter at 5, the case gets its canvas cover, the slicer gets its cleaning, the trays go into the back cooler with their covers on. You untie your apron and hang it on its hook. You put on your coat. You walk through the quiet store, past the covered counter and the dark produce section, and the canned goods standing in their rows on their shelves, and you go home. The neighbourhood will eat tonight and tomorrow and through the weekend with some portion of what you sold today. The sandwiches will be made from the bologna and the American and the boiled ham you sliced with the particular thickness each customer specified. The casseroles will include what you sold from the case. The children's school lunches will include what their mothers asked for by name, and some of them will grow up with a specific memory of the taste of the provolone or the olive loaf or the hard salami that they will not be able to articulate as a memory until they encounter the taste again years later in an entirely different context and find themselves briefly and completely transported somewhere they did not expect to be transported to, which is Tuesday morning at Kowalski's on Elm Street, with the case in its fluorescent light, and the sound of the slicer, and the smell of the cold cuts, and the specific weight of a package wrapped in white deli paper and handed across the counter. There is a version of the post-war American supermarket that exists in memory and in old photographs, and in the way people who grew up in those decades describe it when they describe it warmly, and that version is real. The stores were genuinely impressive by the standards of what had come before. The abundance was genuine, the convenience was genuine, the way the fluorescent light stayed on, and the shelves stayed stocked, and the checkout lines moved, and the parking lot held the cars of 100 families doing their Tuesday errands simultaneously. All of that was real, and it was new, and it was something the generation that had stood in Depression-era lines and bought rationed goods during the war received as the practical material expression of a better time having arrived. But behind that genuine abundance and that genuine convenience was a designed system of considerable sophistication, a system that had spent decades studying the people who moved through it, that had accumulated detailed knowledge of how human beings behave in retail spaces, that had developed tools and techniques for shaping behaviour that the people being shaped were largely unaware of. The supermarket was not built to be a neutral space. It was built to be an optimized space, and what it was optimized for was selling, and the gap between what the store needed and what the customer needed was real and narrow and managed with great precision. The floor plan was not arrived at casually. By the early 1950s, the American supermarket had been shaped by decades of retail research into a form that reflected the accumulated findings of people who had watched customers, tracked their movements, measured their spending by zone and aisle position and time of day, and drawn conclusions that were then built into the design of the space itself. The produce section near the entrance, the dairy case at the back, the end cap displays at the corners of the aisles, the checkout lanes at the exit. These were not the natural geography of a grocery store. They were a designed argument for a specific pattern of movement and purchase. The produce section's position near the entrance has been documented in retail research from the 1930s onward. Fresh produce, with its colours and smells and its implicit associations with health and naturalness, created a positive opening impression that influenced how customers felt about the store and about their shopping trip, which in turn influenced how freely they spent in the aisles that followed. A customer who felt good about the store was a customer more likely to make unplanned purchases, to linger at end caps, to put an extra can in the cart because it looked appealing rather than because it was on the list. The produce section was doing emotional work as much as commercial work, and the emotional work was, from the store's perspective, the more important of the two. The dairy case at the back of the store created a mandatory journey. Milk, butter, eggs, and cream were items that appeared on virtually every family's weekly list. Items whose absence at the end of a trip would require an immediate return visit, which was exactly the kind of inconvenience people took steps to avoid by making sure to get them. Placing these items at the rear of the store meant that every customer had to walk the length of the store to reach them, and then walk back, and the walk there and back was the walk past every other department, every other product, every other opportunity for an unplanned addition to the cart. The store's planners had measured the average unplanned purchase rate by journey length and knew, with the precision of people who had counted the data, that a longer journey between the entrance and the dairy case translated into a higher average transaction value. The end caps, the displays at the ends of each aisle, were a form of retail real estate whose value had been measured against the value of regular shelf space in the middle of the aisle, and found to be dramatically higher by any metric of sales volume. An item on an end cap sold several times better than the same item in its regular shelf position. The reasons were understood. End caps caught the peripheral vision of shoppers turning from one aisle to the next, were visible from the main corridor of the store, benefited from the slight pause in motion that the turn created, and communicated through their placement a temporary or special status that regular shelf position did not communicate. The end cap said, "Pay attention to this one." What was on the end cap was not always what it appeared to be. The store's weekly circular typically featured certain items as sale items, drawing customers in with the promise of reduced prices on things they needed. Some of those items were genuinely on the end caps at the advertised price. The loss leaders, the genuine reductions designed to produce the foot traffic that justified the loss margin. Other end cap items were regular price products that had been given the visual treatment of a promotional display, the coloured signs and the stacked quantities that communicated bargain without the price being any different from what it was on the regular shelf. The display was selling the idea of value rather than value itself, and the idea worked because the display was placed where the idea would be received, in the moment of slightly reduced attention that comes with navigating through a space. The unit pricing problem was one that the industry had every reason not to solve for the customer. When a shopper stood in front of a shelf holding a 12-ounce can of something at 23 cents and a 16-ounce can at 29 cents, the determination of which was the better value required dividing cents by ounces and comparing the resulting fractions, a calculation that required paper and pencil or mental arithmetic, of a kind that was not always available in the middle of the cereal aisle on a Tuesday morning with 2 children attached to the cart and a list with 11 more items on it. The store knew this. The store had no legal obligation to perform this calculation for the shopper and no commercial incentive to do so. The shopper was left with habit, with the look of the packaging, with whatever her mother had bought in a similar situation, with the vague and not entirely reliable impression that the larger size was usually the better value, which was usually true but was not universally true, and the exceptions were not accidental. The store brand products occupied a particular position in the designed persuasion of the supermarket shelf. They were packaged to signal value, to communicate to the customer who chose them that she was being smart, that she was seeing through the advertising premium attached to the name brand and buying the same thing at a lower price. In some cases, this communication was accurate. There were store brand products produced in the same facilities as name brand products, using the same formulations, carrying only the label difference and the price difference. In other cases, the store brand was a genuinely different product, produced to a different specification, and the difference between buying it and buying the name brand was a real difference in what ended up on the table, a difference that the plain packaging was designed to make invisible at the moment of purchase. The shopper had no way to know which situation she was in standing in the aisle. She could guess from the price difference, from what the packaging said or did not say, from her own previous experience with this particular store brand. She could buy it once, form a judgment and adjust. But the adjustment required a prior purchase, which required either the expense of a suboptimal outcome or the effort of remembering which store brands were equivalents and which were not across a full inventory of products, a cognitive task whose scope was considerable given the hundreds of items in a weekly shopping basket. The trading stamps, S&H green stamps and the programs that competed with them were a retail innovation of considerable psychological elegance. At their peak in the late 1950s, they were distributed by perhaps 2/3 of American grocery stores, given to customers at the rate of 1 stamp per 10 cents spent, to be saved in books and eventually redeemed for merchandise from catalogues that offered household goods, small appliances, kitchenware, and similar items. The stamps were presented as a reward, a bonus layered on top of the grocery transaction, something extra the customer received for shopping at this store. The catalogue filled with dreamed-of items, the toaster a few more books away, the mixing bowl set within reach after another few months of shopping, gave customers a forward-looking investment in the relationship with the store that was independent of price and quality, and that created switching costs, the costs of abandoning accumulated stamps and starting over somewhere else, that kept customers who might otherwise have responded to a competitor's promotion steady in their loyalty. What the stamps actually represented, understood from the store's financial perspective, was a portion of the promotional budget that had been converted from a form that directly benefited the customer in the moment of purchase, which would be a lower price, into a form that required accumulation, delayed gratification, ongoing engagement, and catalogue participation before the benefit could be realised. A stamp program cost the store roughly 2% of sales to operate. 2% of sales applied directly to prices would have reduced the customer's cost on every transaction by 2%. Applied to stamps, the 2% created a retention mechanism that cost approximately the same to run but delivered its benefit in a way that served the store's loyalty objectives better than any equivalent price reduction could. This was not deceptive in a way that lent itself to simple description. The stamps were real, the merchandise in the catalogue was real, the redemption was honoured. The customer did receive a benefit. The benefit was simply structured in a way that maximised the store's advantage from the exchange rather than the customer's, in a way that the customer, enjoying the small pleasure of pressing stamps into a book and watching the book fill, was not necessarily tracking at the level of financial analysis. The weekly circular was the store's primary communication to the outside world, delivered to every address in the coverage area by Thursday or Friday, the arrival of it on the mat or in the mailbox, a regular domestic event that generations of American housewives incorporated into their weekly rhythm. The circular was informational in the way that a piece of rhetoric is informational, genuinely factual in its details while structured to produce a specific response in the reader. The sale items listed were genuinely on sale, the prices were accurate. What the circular was also doing, without stating it, was establishing reference prices, giving the reader a framework of normal costs against which the week's sale prices could be measured and found satisfying. You did not know a good deal was a good deal without a baseline price, and the circular was providing that baseline in the same document it was announcing the deal, which is a piece of persuasive efficiency that required no deception and relied entirely on the cognitive framework it constructed for the reader before the reader arrived at the store. The people who designed these systems were not villains. They were business people competing in a market with thin margins, under pressure from competitors who were doing the same thing, trying to grow profitable businesses in a retail category that had always been challenging and was becoming more so as chains expanded and the mom-and-pop stores that had no budgets for end-cap displays or trading stamp programs found themselves increasingly unable to compete on the terms that the supermarket era had established. The systems they built were rational responses to the conditions they were operating under, and many of the systems genuinely served customers in ways that were real, making grocery shopping faster and more efficient and more abundant than it had ever previously been. What the systems did not do was make the store's logic transparent. The shopper who arrived at the A&P on a Tuesday morning with her list and her budget moved through a space that had been designed with knowledge of her behaviour that she did not have of her own behaviour, that had been organised around her tendencies in ways she could not fully see because the organisation was invisible by design. She was intelligent and resourceful, and careful with her money and genuinely skilled at the work of feeding her family within her means. She was also operating in an environment that was systematically better informed about the dynamics of her purchasing decisions than she was about those same dynamics. The information was not symmetrical. It was never going to be symmetrical. The store had resources for studying the pattern, and she had a Tuesday morning and a list and a cart. What she did with those resources was impressive. The list she carried was itself a planning document of real complexity, a record of the week's needs mapped onto the store's geography, reflecting the contents of the refrigerator and pantry, and the planned menus and the children's preferences and the budget and the knowledge accumulated over years of weekly trips about which brands were worth the premium and which were not. She moved through the designed space with the competence of someone who knew the space well enough to navigate it efficiently, who had learned its patterns without necessarily analysing its intentions, who bought what her family needed at prices she had assessed over time and understood who came home with the bags that became the week's meals and the week's ordinary days. She was buying groceries inside a system that was designed to shape her choices, and she was doing it well, with the intelligence and care of someone who fed her family with skill and purpose every week. And the fact that the system was designed to shape her choices does not diminish the intelligence and care, any more than the fact that she did not fully see the system diminishes the system's existence. Both things were true simultaneously: the designed environment and the competent navigator, the asymmetric information and the resourceful shopper. This was the ordinary condition of buying groceries in post-war America, and it is a condition that has not changed entirely, only become larger and more sophisticated in the decades since. Tonight we spent our time inside the grocery stores of mid-century America, and we brought 4 different angles to bear on what might look at first like a simple subject: the weekly errand of a family that needed to eat. What we found, as we almost always find when we look closely enough at anything ordinary, was that the ordinary was not simple. The woman with the list and the dark green Ford gave us the inside of the thing, the physical experience of what it was to feed a family in 1953, the cold of the dairy case and the smell of the produce section, and the transaction with Harold and the specific, earned competence of someone who had done this hundreds of times and had gotten good at it without ever being asked to demonstrate or describe the getting good. She gave us the invisible labour, the planning that looked like a list, the memory that looked like habit, the intelligence that looked like routine. She also gave us, in the specific satisfactions of the Tuesday morning, the small pleasures that sustained the life even in its most repetitive expressions: the percolator cycling to life in the early morning, the weight of a well-packed grocery bag, the brief human warmth of the exchange at the meat counter. Clarence Saunders gave us the origin story, the thing underneath the thing, the reminder that the open shelves and the priced individual items and the self-service basket and the checkout lane all had to be invented by someone, and that the someone who invented them was a man of considerable intelligence and audacity who built his idea into an empire, lost the empire to forces he could not control and would never fully forgive, and kept going anyway, kept building, kept believing in the idea until the body wore out and the kidoozle sat in its prototype, and the world moved forward using the system he'd made for it, without much pausing to remember who had made it. The woman behind the counter gave us the human infrastructure of the neighbourhood grocery, the person who stood between the product and the customer, and was, in ways nobody named, the living memory of what 200 families ate and how they liked it, sliced, and what they needed today and what they might need next week. She gave us the social intelligence that no job description contained, the quiet tending of community that happened at the counter between the slicing and the wrapping, the specific small kindnesses that cost nothing and accumulated into something real over years. And the hidden architecture of the supermarket gave us the fuller truth of what the institution actually was, the designed environment behind the clean tile and the fluorescent light, the asymmetric knowledge that organised the customer's journey without the customer's awareness, the ways in which the store's needs and the customer's needs overlapped, and the ways in which they diverged, and how the divergence was managed with the sophisticated invisibility of a system that worked best when it was least visible. What connects all of these is the same thread that connects every episode we spend our time on here, which is the gap between the image and the reality, between the gleaming photograph and the tired feet, between the cheerful circular and the designed floor plan, between the clerk's professional pleasantness and the occupational labour it cost. between the abundant shelf and the story of who invented the abundant shelf and what it cost them. The gap is not a flaw in the story. The gap is the story. It is where the actual human experience lives, in the space between what was presented and what was true, between what the advertisement showed and what the woman came home to, between the version of post-war American domestic life that was easy to photograph and the version that required getting up before the sun had fully committed to the day and making the coffee and adding up the list and driving to the A&P and pushing the cart and talking to Harold and getting home before 11 because the week needed the morning. The people who lived inside these routines were not naive and they were not simple. They were resourceful, competent, economically pressured, socially engaged, and doing the continuous, invisible, under-acknowledged work of keeping the world running at its most immediate scale. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive, which is the scale of the house and the family and the weekly rhythm that holds the house and the family in their shape. They navigated systems that were not designed for their comfort. They found their pleasures inside their constraints. They did the work and fed the family and kept the books balanced and drove home with the bags and put the milk away first and then the eggs. Somewhere, in a kitchen that will never be photographed for any magazine, in a house on a street where the neighbour knows which day is grocery day, the list is already written and the car keys are already hanging on their hook and the week is already being provisioned by someone who knows exactly what she is doing and has never been asked to explain it. Rest well. That is where we came from, and it is not a small thing. The grocery list of a 1950s family was a document that looked simple and was not. It was simple in the sense that it was a piece of paper with words on it. It was not simple in the sense that the words on it represented the accumulated knowledge of a household's needs, the inventory of what was running low and what had run out and what the week ahead was going to require, the negotiation between what the children would eat and what the adults preferred and what the budget would sustain, and the geography of the store mapped onto the sequence of items, the route through the aisles implicit in the order the list was written. A grocery list was a planning document. It was also a budget document. It was also a social document, in the sense that what a family ate communicated who they were, what their background was, what they aspired to, what their Saturday dinner meant to them, and to whoever they invited to it. The families of the 1950s were grocery shopping in a moment when the grocery store was itself in transition, moving from the smaller, service-oriented neighborhood store that had dominated American retail food for generations toward the larger, self-service supermarket format that would eventually displace it almost entirely. In 1950, many American families still had both available: the neighborhood grocer who knew your name and carried your account and would deliver if you called ahead, and the A&P or Safeway or Kroger chain store a slightly longer drive away, where the prices were lower and the selection was larger and the experience was faster and more anonymous. The choice between them was not simply economic, it was social. The neighborhood grocer offered things the supermarket did not and could not offer, things that did not appear on any price list but that were real and valued by the people who had grown up using them. Account credit was one. A good neighborhood grocer carried accounts for regular customers, meaning they could shop when they needed to and pay when the money arrived, a form of informal consumer credit that predated credit cards and that operated on mutual trust rather than interest rates. This was particularly important for families whose income came in uncertain or irregular patterns, the families of seasonal workers and small farmers, and anyone else whose money did not arrive on a predictable schedule. The neighborhood grocer who had known your family for 20 years and knew when you would be good for it was providing a financial service that the chain store would not and could not provide, organized around relationship rather than transaction. The neighborhood grocer also knew your preferences in a way that the self-service chain store was structurally incapable of knowing. He knew that you wanted the chuck roast trimmed a specific way, that your husband was partial to a particular cut that was not always in the case but that could be set aside if you called on Thursday, that your mother-in-law's birthday was in April, and that you tended to buy a better cut of beef in the week before it. This knowledge was social capital accumulated through years of regular transaction, and it produced a shopping experience that was more efficient in a personal sense, more responsive to the individual, more attentive to the specific, even if it was less efficient in the economic sense of offering the lowest prices across a full basket of goods. The chain stores understood their advantages clearly and pressed them with consistency. Lower prices were the primary advantage, achieved through the economies of scale that came from purchasing in quantities no independent grocer could match, and from the operational efficiency of the self-service model that reduced labour costs significantly compared to the counter-service model. The chain stores also offered selection, a breadth of product that grew through the decade as manufacturers introduced new items and the stores competed with each other by adding categories and expanding their inventory. By the mid-1950s, a well-stocked A&P carried several thousand distinct items, a number that would have been inconceivable in the neighbourhood grocer format, and that reflected the expanding American consumer economy in its full mid-century abundance. But the neighbourhood grocer persisted in diminished form through the decade and beyond, in part because of loyalty and familiarity, in part because of genuine service advantages, and in part because for families without cars or families in neighbourhoods where the supermarket had not yet arrived, the neighbourhood store was simply what was available. The geography of grocery retail in 1953 was not uniform. Cities had their patterns, small towns had theirs, rural areas had theirs, and the transition to the supermarket format moved through these geographies at different speeds, leaving behind pockets of the older form in places where the economics of the newer form had not yet arrived or where the character of the neighbourhood sustained it. The physical act of grocery shopping in this era was more physically demanding than it would become. You carried your bags. The bags were paper, large and double-walled, and full they were heavy, and the walk from the car to the house with 2 full bags required the grip strength and the balance that came from doing it regularly. The specific technique of a bag balanced against the hip, the other bag in the crook of the arm, the body accommodating the load in a way that became automatic. You also carried the mental weight of the list and the budget and the knowledge of what was needed, which was its own kind of labour, the labour of maintaining the inventory of a household and keeping it aligned with the resources available to maintain it. The budget for groceries in the 1950s household was a real constraint that shaped every decision in the store, sometimes visibly and sometimes invisibly. The average American family in the early 1950s spent somewhere between 20 and 25% of its income on food, which was a larger share than it would be in later decades, as food prices fell relative to income and other expense categories expanded. This meant that the grocery trip was a financial transaction of some significance, not a casual spending event, but a careful one, managed by the women who did most of the grocery shopping in this era, with an attentiveness to price and value that the supermarket's designed environment was working continuously to diffuse. The strategies for managing the grocery budget were real and practiced and varied across households and backgrounds and economic circumstances. Some families kept strict grocery budgets, a fixed amount per week, and the shopping was done within that amount with the kind of constraint management that required knowing prices from memory, substituting freely when something was out of range that week, choosing cuts of meat and varieties of produce and sizes of packages, with the continuous cost-benefit calculation running in the background. Other families kept looser budgets, a general sense of what the week should cost rather than a precise ceiling, but still managing the total with attention and care. In all these cases, the person doing the shopping was performing a kind of ongoing financial management that was invisible to the household accounts because it never appeared as a line item, only as the total at the bottom of the receipt, which was either within range or not and was managed accordingly. The relationship between food and occasion was specific and codified in this era in ways that have softened since. Weekday meals had their character, economical and familiar and efficient, the kind of food that could be assembled from pantry staples, and the week's groceries in reasonable time by someone who had been doing other things all day. Sunday dinner had a different character, a more substantial meal that reflected the social importance of Sunday as the week's primary family gathering, the meal that might include guests, that merited a better cut of meat and a dessert made from scratch, and the good dishes rather than the everyday ones. Holiday meals had their own elaborate protocols, specific dishes associated with specific occasions that in some families had been made the same way for generations, and that could not be adjusted without comment. This calendar of eating shaped the grocery trip in specific ways. You bought for the week ahead, but you bought with the knowledge of what that week's shape was, whether it was an ordinary week or a week with Sunday guests or a week with a birthday or a holiday approaching. The list for a Thanksgiving week was structurally different from the list for an ordinary November week, not just in quantity but in category, in the specific items that only appeared for this occasion, the cranberry sauce and the sweet potatoes and the sage for the stuffing and the extra butter that a Thanksgiving required. The list for a week when company was coming to Sunday dinner was different from the list for a week when it was just the family, reflecting the social performance of the Sunday table and the specific assessment of what that performance required. The habit of buying certain things only at certain stores was real and established in most households of this era. The grocery store was for groceries, but the boundary of what belonged to the grocery store and what belonged elsewhere was drawn differently by different families and in different regions. Some families bought their meat only at a dedicated butcher shop, a separate transaction at a separate establishment from the chain grocery, because they believed, often correctly, that the butcher's meat was better, cut better, from better animals, and that the expertise of a dedicated butcher was worth the additional transaction. Some families bought their bread only from a bakery, the fresh-baked bread of a neighbourhood bakery being a different product from the Wonder Bread or Pepperidge Farm available in the grocery store, a product that cost more and lasted fewer days but that tasted of something the factory bread did not taste of. The produce was the category where the seasonal calendar was most directly felt. In summer, the garden produced tomatoes and cucumbers and beans and whatever else the family had planted, and the grocery trip reflected this, producing less in the produce section and more in the canned goods section in preparation for the preserving that summer produce required. In winter, the produce section offered what it offered, which was limited, transported, and in some cases genuinely inferior to what summer had provided, and the household adjusted to this without complaint, or with the specific modest complaint of someone who knows the situation is temporary and that August will return. The canning and preserving that many households of this era still practiced was its own relationship with the grocery store, a seasonal supplement to the year-round purchasing that produced rows of canned tomatoes and pickles and preserved fruits in the pantry, the evidence of summer's abundance carried forward into winter, reducing the grocery bill for certain categories during the months when fresh produce was expensive or unavailable. The ball jars and their lids were a pantry staple. The pressure canner and the boiling water bath were kitchen equipment used seasonally, with the competence that came from having done it every summer, producing food that the family trusted because they had produced it themselves under conditions they controlled and could vouch for. The grocery store of the 1950s was also a place where the relationship between food and health was understood in ways that were partly correct and partly the products of their era, informed by nutritional science that had made genuine advances and by marketing that had made its own advances, and by the intersection of the two in the specific form of the health claim on a product package, which was sometimes backed by solid science and sometimes backed by the science that the manufacturer had found most helpful to cite. Vitamins were a significant category of this relationship. The fortification of foods with vitamins had begun in earnest in the 1930s and continued through the post-war decades as a genuine public health measure, adding nutrients to staple foods that many Americans were deficient in: iodine to salt, vitamin D to milk, B vitamins to flour and bread, iron to cereal. These additions were based on documented deficiency evidence and had real health effects. They were also, from the manufacturer's perspective, a marketing opportunity, a way to distinguish a product in a category where products were otherwise nearly identical, and the distinction was promoted enthusiastically on packaging and in advertising in ways that sometimes overstated the significance of the vitamin content and occasionally implied health benefits that went beyond what the science supported. The family that stood in the cereal aisle in 1953 reading the back of a box of Wheaties was receiving information that was partly accurate and partly aspirational, partly the result of actual nutritional science, and partly the result of the marketing department's assessment of what language would move product. This was not unusual. It was the general condition of health-related food claims in this era, when the regulatory framework for such claims was less developed than it would become, when the distinction between a documented health benefit and an implied one was not always politely maintained, and when the housewife who cared about feeding her family well had to navigate between genuine information and genuine persuasion using whatever judgment she had available, which was considerable but was not the same as having the regulatory infrastructure that would develop in later decades. The frozen food section, which was expanding rapidly in the early 1950s, represented a genuine technological development in the management of the family food supply, and also a change in the domestic routine that was not without its social and cultural dimensions. Clarence Birdseye had developed the quick freezing process in the 1920s, and by the post-war decades the technology had improved enough, and the refrigeration infrastructure had spread enough, that frozen foods were becoming a standard section of the supermarket rather than a novelty. Frozen orange juice concentrate was adopted almost universally in the early part of the decade, replacing the labour and expense of fresh oranges for morning juice with a product that was faster to prepare, cheaper to buy, available year-round and consistent in quality. Frozen vegetables were following, offering peas and corn and green beans in a preserved form that was in some nutritional respects superior to canned, and in convenience respects superior to fresh out of season. The cultural response to frozen foods was not uniformly enthusiastic, and the hesitation was not irrational. Frozen food represented a departure from the scratch cooking model that was both a practical domestic norm and, for many women, a skill of which they were genuinely proud, a skill that their mothers had taught them and that they had refined through years of practice. A woman who made her own biscuits from flour and butter, and her own estimation of how much milk the dough wanted was doing something different from a woman who bought frozen biscuits. And the difference was not simply a difference in convenience or cost. It was a difference in what cooking meant in the household, what it communicated about the woman who did it, what relationship it established between her and the food she fed her family. These were not small things. They were the medium through which domestic identity was expressed and maintained, and the frozen food revolution was, among its other dimensions, an implicit challenge to that identity, which is part of why it met resistance in certain quarters, even as it was adopted in others. The meal planning that the weekly grocery trip was organised around was a cognitive exercise that happened in pieces throughout the week, not in a single sitting, but in the accumulated mental inventory of what needed to happen between Monday and Sunday, and what the refrigerator and pantry currently contained, and what was required to close the gap. By Tuesday morning, the plan for the week was substantially formed, not written down in most cases, not formal, but present and organised in the mind of the person who had done the cooking and the shopping, long enough to hold the week's menu in her head the way an experienced cook holds a recipe in her hands, through feel and knowledge and the accumulated practice of having done it enough times to know what it requires without needing to check. The planning was never purely practical. It was also social, reflecting the family's patterns and preferences and obligations. You knew your husband's preferences with the precision of years of observation. You knew that he would eat anything you put in front of him without complaint, but that he had genuine preferences. The pot roast on Saturday, the meatloaf on Wednesday, the particular way the pork chops wanted to be made, the things that constituted comfort food in the specific register of his comfort, and that accommodating these preferences was part of what the cooking meant, part of the relationship with the person you were feeding, part of the domestic language in which care was expressed through the specificity of what was on the table Thursday evening. The children had their preferences too, and the management of those preferences was its own ongoing negotiation, conducted daily over every meal, in the quiet but continuous form of what appeared on the table and what was expected to be eaten. You did not run a restaurant. You did not make 3 different dinners for 3 different preferences. What was served was what was available, and what was available was what had been planned and bought and prepared, and the expectation was that it would be eaten, with whatever degree of enthusiasm the eater happened to bring to it. This expectation was enforced with varying degrees of rigour in different households, and with varying degrees of success in all of them. But the underlying principle was stable. The food was made with care, and the care was to be received with respect, which was itself a form of domestic education, a teaching about the relationship between effort and gratitude that most households of this era took seriously, and that the kitchen table was one of the primary places it was conducted. The grocery store was the beginning of all of this, the place where the week's feeding started, where the raw materials were assembled that the kitchen would transform and the table would distribute, and the family would consume and carry forward into the energy of their days. The trip was unglamorous and repetitive and structured by requirement rather than preference, and it was also the practical expression of the commitment to feed people well with the resources available, to manage the intersection of budget and nutrition and preference and occasion, with the competence of someone who had been doing it long enough to do it without thinking about it. The list was the tool, the store was the source, the cart was the vehicle, the bags were the delivery system, and Tuesday morning was when it all happened, every week, with the specific ordinary reliability that keeps a household running and that no one ever thanks anyone for quite sufficiently. Every grocery store of the 1950s era had its specific geography of loyalty and habit. the specific way that families organized their shopping around the stores available to them, the patterns that had formed through years of use and that reflected the social geography of the neighborhood as much as they reflected the commercial geography of the retail market. The woman who drove to the A&P on Main Street was making a choice, not always consciously, about which part of the neighborhood's commercial life she was sustaining with her $12.37. And the choice had implications beyond the transaction itself, implications that were not generally examined in the car on the way to the store, but that were real nonetheless. The post-war American grocery market was consolidating rapidly through the decade, the large chain stores growing in size and number, while the independent grocers contracted, a consolidation driven by the economics of scale that the large chains could exploit and the small operators could not. This was understood by people who paid attention to retail commerce, but it was not a prominent concern of the weekly grocery trip. The concern of the weekly grocery trip was the list and the budget, and whether the pork chops were well trimmed, and whether Betty at the checkout was working today because Betty was quick and you had places to be. The large food manufacturers understood the grocery store of the 1950s with a precision that the grocery store's customers mostly lacked, because the manufacturers were spending considerable resources to develop that understanding. Market research, which had been a developing discipline since the 1920s, had by the post-war decades become a sophisticated practice employed by every major food company to understand who was buying their products, why, when, and under what circumstances the purchase might be switched to a competitor or lost entirely to a category alternative. This research produced knowledge about consumer behavior that was then applied to packaging design, to advertising strategy, to the specific placement of products within the store, and to the promotional programs that sought to make a product memorable and preferred across the thousands of individual purchasing decisions that made up a family's year of grocery shopping. The packaging design of a mid-century canned good or boxed cereal was not accidental. Every element of it, the colours, the typeface, the illustration, the placement of the brand name relative to the product name, the specific language of any claims made on the front panel, had been considered by people whose job it was to consider it, tested in research settings, revised based on what the research found, and finalised as the result of a process that was more deliberate than anything the average shopper was applying to the decision of whether to put it in her cart. The red of a Campbell's soup can was not arbitrary. It had been chosen and maintained because decades of consistent use had made it a recognition signal so strong that it worked from across the aisle, from peripheral vision, from the corner of the eye during a moment of distracted shopping, the red triggering the brand recognition before the label was read. The woman who put the Campbells in her cart because she had always put the Campbells in her cart was not being manipulated in any simple or insulting sense. She was responding to real experience with a product that had been consistently satisfactory over many years, a product that had become part of her household's vocabulary of food, a reliable element of the domestic inventory. The preference was real. The process by which the preference had been created and maintained was more designed than it felt from inside the preference. But the preference itself was genuine, and the genuineness of the preference is not undone by the knowledge of how it was produced, any more than your fondness for a song is undone by the knowledge that it was composed with craft and intention. This is the honest, complicated truth of the American grocery store in its mid-century form. It was a place of genuine abundance and genuine convenience and genuine pleasure. The abundance of a country that had emerged from depression and war into a prosperity that expressed itself most immediately and tangibly in what was on the shelves and what could be put in the cart. It was also a designed environment, organised around the commercial interests of the store and the manufacturers whose products it carried, applying knowledge of consumer behaviour to the service of those interests in ways that were not transparent and not always identical to the customer's interests. These two truths existed simultaneously in the same space, under the same fluorescent lights, between the same rows of shelves, and the family that moved through it was living both truths at once, the genuine pleasure of choosing and buying and feeding and the equally genuine participation in an economic system that was working continuously to shape those choices in directions they did not always control. Understanding this does not require cynicism about the era or the people in it. It requires only the honest acknowledgement that commercial systems are designed to serve the interest of their designers, that those interests and the customer's interests are related but not identical, and that the gap between them is not unique to the 1950s, or to the grocery store, or to any particular industry or decade, but is a permanent feature of commercial life, managed differently in different eras and under different regulatory regimes and in different relationships between the institution and the people it serves, but never absent, never fully resolved, never entirely closed. The housewife who drove home from the A&P on Tuesday with her bags full and her $12.37 spent was doing what she always did, which was to feed her family as well as she could with what she had, in the specific conditions of her specific Tuesday morning, within the specific constraints of her specific household budget and kitchen schedule. She was doing it well. She was also doing it inside a system that was considerably better informed about her behaviour than she was about its intentions, and that asymmetry was simply part of the condition of being a consumer in the American economy of that decade, part of the texture of daily life that was present but not examined, because daily life contains too many things to examine them all, and the examining must wait for the history books and the long view that they provide. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Tonight we have spent our time inside the grocery stores and grocery trips of mid-century America, and we have looked at them from 4 different distances and 4 different angles, and what we have found, as we always find when we look closely at ordinary things, is that the ordinary is layered, that every routine conceals within it the story of how it was invented, the labour of the people who maintained it, the social intelligence of the community that depended on it, and the designed systems that organised it for purposes that were not always announced. The woman with the list in her coat pocket who drove to the store on a Tuesday morning was the protagonist of her own week in a way that no magazine photograph adequately captured, because magazine photographs showed her kitchen and her meals, and her family gathered around the table, but did not show the Tuesday morning competence that made the kitchen and the meals and the family gathering possible, the knowledge in her hands and her head, the planning that looked like habit, the care that looked like routine. She was doing something real and requiring. She was doing it without the acknowledgement that real and requiring things deserve, and she was doing it again next week, and the week after that, and for as many weeks as the week required it of her. Clarence Saunders built the system she moved through, built it once and lost it, and built it again and lost it again, and spent his remaining years trying to build it a third time in a form that the technology of his era could not yet reliably sustain. He died in the year of her Tuesday morning, in the city where he had built his first store and his mansion and his corner, with the legacy of his idea visible in the stores of every American city, and the legacy of his fortune visible mainly in its absence. The idea outlived the fortune. The idea is still here. The woman behind the counter at Kowalski's on Elm Street stood between the neighbourhood and its food, with the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of someone who was present at the intersection every day, who knew 200 families and what they ate and how they liked it sliced and what they needed and what they might need next week. She was the living index of the neighbourhood's food habits, the memory of its preferences, the daily practitioner of the small social intelligence that held community together in the transactions too small for anyone to name. She was tired at 5 o'clock and she came back at 6:30 the next morning. And the store they all moved through, the designed space with its fluorescent light and its carefully positioned dairy case, and its end cap displays and its weekly circular, and its trading stamps and its thoughtfully calibrated relationship with the customer's budget and attention, was both a service and a persuasion, both a genuine abundance and a commercial machine, both a place that made Tuesday morning easier and a place that was making Tuesday morning work for itself at the same time. Knowing this enriches the picture without diminishing anyone in it. The families were real, the food was real, the labour was real, the design was real, the system was real. All of it was happening simultaneously in the same space, and the history of it is the history of all of it together. Sleep well tonight. Somewhere, in a kitchen that smells of coffee and something baking low in the oven, in a house where the refrigerator is cycling in the early morning quiet, a woman who has been feeding people all week without being asked how she does it, is finally, briefly, at rest. There is something worth sitting with in the Tuesday morning grocery trip that we have not fully named yet, which is the way it was connected, through a dozen small threads, to every other system the family inhabited. The grocery store was not an island. It was a node in a network that included the food manufacturers who filled its shelves, and the advertising agencies who told the family about the food manufacturers, and the magazines that carried the advertisements, and the television programs that turned certain brands into household names by the simple repetition of images and jingles through the evenings of a decade, the woman who put the Crisco in her cart was putting it there partly because her mother used Crisco, and partly because the Crisco advertisement in the Ladies' Home Journal had shown her a pie crust so beautiful it looked like a photograph of what a pie crust was supposed to aspire to, and the two influences were indistinguishable from the inside, which is how influence works when it is working well. The Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, Better Homes and Gardens, Woman's Day, and the other women's magazines of the post-war era were the primary print medium through which the food manufacturers reached the women who did the grocery shopping. And they were also, not coincidentally, magazines whose editorial content was deeply intertwined with the advertising that surrounded it. The recipes in these magazines were real recipes, tested and useful, and they also happened to require the products that were advertised in the pages adjacent to them, a relationship between editorial and advertising that was not always disclosed, and that produced a document in which the recipe for the cream of mushroom soup casserole and the Campbell's advertisement 3 pages later were part of the same argument, just wearing different clothes. The recipes themselves were influential in ways that extended beyond the magazines. A dish that appeared in Good Housekeeping in 1952 could appear on kitchen tables across the country within a year, carried there by the women who had read the magazine and tried the recipe and liked it, and told their neighbours who tried it, and told their neighbours, and so the American family's recipe vocabulary expanded through this informal network of recommendation and imitation that had the magazines at its origin but was distributed through the actual daily life of actual households. This is how things like the tuna noodle casserole and the green bean casserole and the Jell-O mold with fruit suspended in it became ubiquitous, not through any centralized mandate, but through the organic propagation of an idea that started as a recipe in a magazine and ended as a dish on 100,000 Tuesday night tables. The Jell-O mold deserves its own moment, because it is a dish that encapsulates the 1950s kitchen with a completeness that almost no other single food can match, expressing at once the era's enthusiasm for processed foods, its comfort with sweet elements in savoury contexts, its appreciation of the visually impressive over the merely delicious, its willingness to use gelatin as a structural principle in contexts where gelatin has no obvious structural purpose. Jell-O had been around since the 1890s, but it was in the post-war decades that it reached its peak of cultural influence, assisted by the Jell-O company's recipe booklets and advertising, and by the fact that it was cheap, available everywhere, and capable of producing a centerpiece dish from materials that cost very little, and required no cooking skill beyond the ability to follow directions. A Jell-O mold with fruit or vegetables suspended in it looked like a considerable effort and was not. It looked like something a caterer might produce and was made in a $4 box of powder dissolved in water. It was the kind of dish that the era rewarded for its appearance as much as for its flavour, which is either a comment on the era's aesthetics or on the flexibility of beauty as a standard, depending on how you feel about Jell-O. The canned goods that lined the pantry shelves of the 1950s household were another expression of the era's enthusiastic relationship with processed food as progress, as the practical application of modern technology to the domestic problem of feeding a family efficiently and safely. Canning had been a domestic practice for generations before it became an industrial one, and the transition from the home canning that filled the basement shelves with mason jars every summer to the factory canning that filled the grocery store shelves with Del Monte tomatoes and green giant corn was a transition in who did the preserving and where, not in whether preserving happened. The canned good was not a novelty in 1953. It was a staple, trusted, used constantly, integrated into the household's food vocabulary with the completeness of something that had been there as long as anyone could remember. What was newer was the degree of reliance on canned goods as the primary, rather than supplemental form of preserved food in the household, a reliance that reflected the reduction in home canning that had been happening throughout the 40s and that continued through the 50s as the labour of summer canning competed with the convenience of the supermarket shelf and sometimes lost. A woman who had grown up canning with her mother, who had spent August afternoons in a hot kitchen with a pressure canner and rows of mason jars, might herself be buying Campbell's condensed soup in the winter instead of using the tomatoes she had put up herself, because the Campbell's was always there and always the same and cost 33 cents and required opening a can, and the tomatoes required a hot August afternoon plus the ongoing attention to the jars in the basement. Both choices were rational. The second was progressively more common through the decade. The Swanson TV dinner, which arrived in 1953, the same year as our Tuesday morning, represented the logical extreme of this progression toward convenience, the fully prepared meal that required only heating and serving, the ultimate elimination of the cooking step from the domestic food chain. The TV dinner was not a threat to the weekly grocery trip in any immediate sense. It was a novelty at first, then a convenience item, then eventually a category of its own in the frozen food section. But it was also an indicator of a direction, a product that existed because the society that bought it had decided that there were circumstances under which having someone else do all the cooking was acceptable and even desirable, a judgment that previous generations had reached only in the form of restaurants, and that was now available in the kitchen, in the freezer, at a price point accessible to most households. The relationship between all of these changes and the weekly grocery trip was continuous and cumulative. The grocery trip of 1953 was not the grocery trip of 1933, and the grocery trip of 1963 would not be the grocery trip of 1953. The store was changing, the products it carried were changing, the habits of the people who shopped it were changing, and the changes were in dialogue with each other, the store responding to what people wanted by stocking it, the manufacturers responding to what the stores stocked by advertising it, the families responding to the advertising by buying it, the buying reshaping the habit reshaping the list reshaping the Tuesday morning. It was a system in motion, slow enough that no single Tuesday felt like change, but fast enough that the Tuesdays of a decade looked quite different from each other in aggregate. The counter at Kowalski's was part of this system of change, and it was also one of the things the change was slowly eroding. The neighborhood grocery counter was a labor-intensive operation that required skilled people and produced a premium experience that a growing portion of the market was deciding it did not need to pay for. The chain stores were winning on price. The supermarkets were winning on selection and convenience. The neighborhood counter was winning on relationship and quality and the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of the person behind it. But these advantages were harder to quantify and less universally valued than price and selection and convenience. The counter persisted because it served real needs, and because the people who valued what it offered valued it genuinely and loyally. But its share of the grocery market was contracting through the decade, and the trend was not reversing. This is not a lament. It is simply an honest description of what was happening, the way commercial and technological change always reshapes the landscape of the ordinary, making some things available that were not available before, while making other things less available, trading one set of satisfactions for another. The woman behind the counter at Kowalski's was providing something that the A&P could not provide, and the A&P was providing something that Kowalski's could not provide, and the families of the neighborhood were distributing their Tuesday mornings between these two options according to what they needed on any given week, which was a reasonable response to the reasonable fact that different institutions serve different needs, and that having both available is better than having only one. What the counter at Kowalski's would eventually become, over the following decades, was a memory. A specific, warm, detailed memory in the minds of people who had grown up shopping there with their mothers, who could reconstruct the smell of the cold cuts case, and the sound of the Hobart slicer, and the look of Harold's practiced fold on the white butcher paper, who would encounter these things in some combination in their adult lives, and feel, briefly and completely, the specific quality of being a child at a counter where the person behind it knew their name and their mother's name, and the thickness of the salami their family preferred. This is what neighborhood commerce leaves behind when it leaves, a texture of memory that is available to the people who lived inside it, and that cannot be replicated by the institutions that replace it, which is neither a condemnation of those institutions nor a simple endorsement of what was lost, but simply the honest accounting of what commercial change costs in the currency of ordinary human experience. The grocery store habits of the 1950s family that no longer exist are not primarily about specific products or specific stores or even specific rituals, though all of those are part of it. They are about the relationship between the family and its food supply, the directness of that relationship, the proximity between the person who needed the food and the person who sold it, the knowledge on both sides of the transaction, the way that relationship was embedded in the social life of the neighborhood rather than being purely commercial. The housewife who talked to Harold about his grandchildren while he wrapped her chuck roast was doing something that cannot be replicated by a self-serve meat counter and a QR code. Not because the self-serve meat counter is inferior in the practical dimensions of meat selection and purchase, but because the conversation with Harold was itself something, a form of social tissue that held the neighbourhood together in aggregate, one transaction at a time, across a decade of Tuesday mornings. These things did not disappear because anyone decided they should disappear. They changed because the conditions that sustained them changed, because cars became universal, and supermarkets became larger, and prices fell, and selection expanded, and the economics of the neighbourhood counter became more difficult to sustain against the competition of institutions that could do some of what it did better and cheaper. The families made rational choices within their rational constraints, and the aggregate of those rational choices produced a grocery landscape that looks quite different from the one our Tuesday morning housewife inhabited, which is neither a tragedy nor a triumph but a change, with the costs and benefits that change always brings, neither fully visible at the time nor fully reconcilable in retrospect. What we keep when we keep anything from these decades is the sense of what it felt like from the inside, the specific weight of the grocery bags carried from the car to the kitchen, the specific smell of the store in winter, the specific quality of the human transaction at the counter, where someone had learned your name and your preferences and your particular measure of salami, the specific satisfaction of a pantry stocked for the week, a refrigerator ordered and full, a list completed and a budget honoured and a family about to be fed. These are the textures of a way of life that is gone, and they are worth remembering not because they were perfect or because the present is worse, but because they were real, and the people inside them were real, and the competence and care they exercised in the ordinary management of the daily week deserved more acknowledgement than it generally received. Let that recognition arrive now, in the quiet of this late hour, in the space between the day you finished and the sleep you are moving toward. The families of those decades did their grocery shopping on Tuesday mornings with thoroughness and care and the specific, unspectacular competence of people who'd been doing it long enough to do it well. The woman behind the counter sliced the salami at the right thickness and wrapped it right and said goodbye with the warmth of someone who would see you next week. The man at the meat counter wrapped your chuck roast and wrote the price with his grease pencil and asked how your husband was doing. The cashier punched the keys with her practiced speed and counted your change back correctly. And the Tuesday morning ended with the groceries put away and the week provisioned and the kitchen ready for whatever the next few days were going to require, which it always was, which it needed to be, which it reliably, quietly, unremarkably was. Good night, sleep well, the week is provided for. The produce bins at the A&P in early 1953 held things that had travelled considerable distances to be there, and this travel was itself a story that the bins did not tell, a story about refrigerated rail cars and distribution networks and the specific geography of American agriculture in the post-war era. The orange in its mesh bag on the shelf near the entrance had come from Florida or California, had been picked by workers whose names and conditions of employment were entirely invisible to the shopper who lifted the bag and felt its weight and put it in the cart. The tomatoes had come from somewhere warm, Texas or Florida, grown for their capacity to survive shipping rather than for their flavour, which is a set of priorities that produces a specific kind of tomato, useful and available and not quite the same thing as what a tomato can be. The lettuce had travelled from the fields of California's Salinas Valley, which was already, by the early 1950s, the primary source of the iceberg lettuce that American families were eating in their salads every week, a fact that the iceberg lettuce itself communicated nothing about. This invisibility of the supply chain was not new to the 1950s, but it was deeper than it had been in the previous generation, when more families had grown some of their own food or had neighbours who grew it, when the connection between the field and the kitchen had been shorter and more visible. The industrialization of American agriculture through the first half of the 20th century had lengthened that connection, had inserted more steps and more distance and more intermediaries between the food's origin and the family's table, and the supermarket was the terminal institution in this lengthening, the place where the distance was finally closed by the act of purchase, without any particular visibility into what the distance had been or what it had contained. This was not, in the daily experience of the 1950s family, a problem that presented itself as a problem. The food was there. It was adequate. It was varied enough to produce interesting meals. It was priced within reach of most families who were managing their budgets competently. The distance it had travelled and the conditions under which it had been grown and processed were not parts of the shopping experience because the shopping experience had been designed to present the end point, not the journey. The The well-lit bins and the fresh-looking displays and the organised rows of canned goods were the conclusion of a process that the store was not in the business of narrating. The question of what food cost, beyond the price on the label, was not a question that the weekly grocery trip was structured to engage with, and it is not a question that historians of domestic life have always given sufficient attention. The food that appeared on Tuesday on the grocery shelves represented a vast amount of agricultural and industrial labour, performed by people whose wages and conditions were not visible in the price of a can of Del Monte tomatoes or a head of iceberg lettuce. The farm workers of California and Florida and Texas who picked the produce, the cannery workers who processed the canned goods, the meatpacking workers who prepared the cuts that Harold retrimmed at the A&P counter. These people were connected to the family's Tuesday morning in the most direct sense possible, through the specific food that the family ate, but the connection was invisible because the system that produced the food was organised specifically around the efficiencies of production and distribution rather than around the visibility of the human labour within it. This is not a 1950s specific observation. It is an observation about industrial food systems generally, in their full historical extent. But the 1950s were the decade in which the American industrial food system reached a kind of first maturity, in which the efficiencies were working, and the abundance was real, and the disconnect between the food on the table and the conditions of its production was at a particular maximum, because the production methods had become efficient enough to produce the food cheaply, but had not yet attracted the scrutiny that would eventually produce the regulatory responses of later decades. The families eating the food were real people, with genuine needs and genuine pleasures and genuine relationships with the food they prepared and shared. The system that produced the food was real too, and the two realities existed in the same world without being in full communication with each other. The kitchen where the groceries landed every Tuesday was a room that absorbed all of this without comment, without analysis, without any particular awareness of the full supply chain that it represented. It was a kitchen where food was prepared and meals were made and families were fed, a room that smelled of coffee in the morning and something cooking through the afternoon, and the specific clean smell of a linoleum floor that had been mopped after dinner. It was a functional room and a social room, and a room with a history in it. The history of every meal that had been made in it since the family moved in. The accumulated evidence of a household's relationship with food, expressed in the arrangement of the pans on their hooks, and the canisters on the counter, and the recipe box between the flour and the coffee. The week would proceed from this kitchen, as it always did. The groceries put away on Tuesday would become meals through Friday and into the weekend, would be transformed by heat and time and the practical intelligence of someone who knew what she was doing, into the specific, unrepeatable dishes that the family ate as Tuesday's pot roast, and Wednesday's meatloaf, and Thursday's pork chops, and Friday's soup made from what was left from Thursday, and Sunday's better meal for whoever was coming, and the cycle would complete itself and begin again. The list would start to form on Wednesday, notes made on the pad in the kitchen drawer, and by Sunday it would be taking its final shape, and by Tuesday morning it would be ready, and the car would be warm, and Betty would be at the register, and Harold would be at the counter, and the week would be stocked, and the kitchen would be ready, and the family would eat. This is the grocery store habit of the 1950s family, the one that no longer exists in this exact form. Not any single practice or product, but the whole of it together. The relationship between the housewife and her store, the relationship between the customer and the counter person, the knowledge on both sides, the social tissue of it, the way the Tuesday morning grocery trip was connected to everything else the week contained, to the meals and the people eating them and the kitchen that held them and the house that held the kitchen and the neighbourhood that held the house. This is what the grocery trip was, not a transaction, an institution, a weekly renewal of the contract between a family and its neighbourhood, expressed in $12.37 and white butcher paper and the specific thickness of the salami and the weight of 2 paper bags carried from the car to the kitchen on a cold Tuesday morning in 1953. We have spent tonight moving through this world from 4 different angles, and each angle has added something the others could not have provided, and together they have given us something close to a full picture, as full as any account of a world this large and this specific can be. The woman who drove to the store and bought the groceries, the man who designed the store and lost it and tried again, the woman who stood behind the counter and held the neighbourhood's food preferences in her memory, the hidden architecture of the designed space that shaped every transaction within it. 4 stories, 4 kinds of knowing, 4 ways of approaching the same ordinary Tuesday morning. What they share is what all the stories we tell here share, which is the presence of real people doing real things inside real systems, doing them with more competence and more care and more intelligence than the systems gave them credit for, building their lives out of the materials available, finding their satisfactions inside their constraints, performing the continuous, invisible, under-acknowledged labour of keeping the world running at the level where it actually runs, which is the level of the kitchen and the table and the grocery list and the Tuesday morning that contains them all. Good night. The grocery list for next week is already starting to form in a kitchen that smells like coffee, in a house where the refrigerator is cycling in the quiet, where someone is figuring out what the week will need and making sure it will be provided. That is the real habit, the one that cannot be replaced, only continued. Rest well. There is one more thing the grocery store of the 1950s held that we have not yet fully accounted for, which is the specific pleasure of the thing itself, the pleasure of the store as a place, separate from its function. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive, available to the shopper who had the time and the attention to notice it. Not everyone had that time, and not every trip allowed for that attention, but when it was available, the grocery store offered something that the purely utilitarian description of it does not capture. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery section, arriving before you reached it, warm and yeasty in the cool store air, was a simple pleasure of the first order. The colour of the oranges in their crates, vivid against the white interior of the produce section, was a kind of beauty available on a Tuesday morning at no extra charge. The weight of a full cart moving through the checkout line, the specific satisfaction of a cart that holds exactly what the week requires, nothing missing and nothing wasted, was a satisfaction available to someone who had planned correctly, which this particular woman had. The brief conversation with Harold about his youngest starting kindergarten was a small human warmth in an otherwise transactional morning, the kind of brief connection that makes the ordinary slightly warmer than it would be without it. These small pleasures were not the point of the grocery trip. They were not what anyone would say they went to the A&P for, but they were real, and they were part of what the grocery store was, in the way that all the small pleasures embedded in necessary routines are part of what those routines are. The thing that makes the repetition bearable, and sometimes, on the right Tuesday morning, something that is genuinely not a burden, genuinely not merely a task, but a small, full, ordinary piece of a good enough life. That is what we have been sitting with tonight. The full, ordinary, sometimes difficult, sometimes quietly pleasurable texture of the way a generation fed itself. The grocery store habits that no longer exist are not simply lost practices. They are a record of what a particular moment in American life felt like from the inside, how it worked, and what it cost, and what small satisfactions it contained, and the record is worth reading carefully, which is what we have tried to do. Sleep well. The list, the car keys, the coat, the lipstick, the cart, the cold of the dairy case, the white paper package, the brown paper bags, the pantry stocked and ordered, the refrigerator humming in the quiet morning. These are the materials of the story. They are enough to build a whole world from, if you look at them carefully, which is the only thing this channel has ever tried to do. Look carefully, sleep well. We will be back next week with another world waiting to be looked at, another ordinary Tuesday morning that turned out on closer examination to be everything. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.